Why we don't all eat kangaroo, when Australia shoots millions of them every year. Right now, as you're listening to this sentence, across a continent of nearly 8 million square kilometers, roughly 50 million animals are moving across the land that nobody fed, nobody watered, nobody vaccinated, and nobody fenced in. Nobody bred them. Nobody paid a vet for them. They don't stand in pens. They don't eat formulated feed. They don't drink from a bore that some farmer paid to drill. They're simply there. They were there before people, and they're there now. Take a conservative average carcass, 30 kilograms of live weight, and that's a modest figure, because a mature male red kangaroo will comfortably hit 90. Multiply it out, and at any given moment, Australia is carrying around 1.5 million tons of living meat. 1.5 million tons. So you can actually see that number instead of just hearing it. The Eiffel Tower weighs about 10,000 tons.
Which means that on the Australian plains right now, there is the equivalent of roughly 150 Eiffel Towers made out of lean red meat. And they grow themselves. Now the second number. In 2025, Australia slaughtered 9.28 million head of cattle, an all-time record, 2.87 million tons of beef, plus almost 25 million lambs. Every single one of those animals had to be bred, raised, fed, watered, transported, fenced, and treated. Every one of them stood on hooves that compact the soil. Every one of them breathed out methane. And in parallel with all of that, the government, not poachers, not some black market, but the state governments themselves, issues permits every year to shoot kangaroos. New South Wales alone set a commercial quota for 2026 of 1,453,025 animals. Not about 1.5 million. Exactly that, down to the last head. 1,453,025. Because the population in that one state's commercial zones is estimated at 9,586,809 kangaroos. And now the part that matters. The meat of this animal contains between 1 and 2% fat. 1%. Chicken breast is 1.5. Beef fillet is over 6. 100 grams of kangaroo gives you 22 grams of protein and up to 3.5 milligrams of iron. By any nutritional standard, this is close to a perfect red meat. It's lean, it's iron-rich, it's wild, and it requires no grain, no antibiotics, and no irrigation system. It's lying on the ground for free. It's legal to take, people do take it, and almost nobody eats it. Most of what gets shot goes either into dog and cat food or into export markets you would never guess. Australians themselves, by and large, don't buy kangaroo. In a country where kangaroos outnumber people almost 2 to 1, the national meat is still beef, raised in a feedlot. So why? The reason isn't one thing. It's 5 factors, and they don't just add up, they multiply each other. The first is historical. How Europeans arriving in Australia spent a single century redefining this animal from food into vermin, and then made it illegal to sell it for human consumption. The second is biological. Kangaroo meat has a physiological quirk that makes it simultaneously a nutritional champion and a disaster for the cook. The third is economic. The industry physically does not have the infrastructure to compete with beef, and there's a reason it never will. The fourth is cultural and psychological, and it's the strongest of the 5. A national symbol on the coat of arms, a children's television series, and one specific mechanism discovered at the University of Pennsylvania. And the fifth is environmental, and in recent years it has been turning the entire argument on its head. Any one of them on its own could be overcome. Together they form a lock that doesn't open. Let's start at the beginning. And the beginning here is far older than you think. 65,000 years versus 250. When we talk about the history of eating kangaroo, we have to be honest about one thing. Almost all of that history is a success story, and only the last 2.5 centuries are a story of refusal. People arrived in Australia at least 65,000 years ago. It's the longest continuous cultural tradition on the planet, and for practically all of that time, the kangaroo was not a symbol, not a character, and not a problem. It was dinner. It was the backbone of protein intake on a continent with not a single large domesticable herbivore. Australia never had native cattle, sheep, goats, or pigs. It had nothing you could tame and keep in a pen. The only substantial source of red meat was a kangaroo you had to track and kill. That is written into the rock, literally. In the galleries of the Kimberley and Arnhem Land, in Kakadu, the kangaroo is one of the most frequent subjects of rock art. And these are not abstract silhouettes. This is the X-ray style.
The artist draws the animal along with its internal organs, its spine, its heart, the contents of its body cavity. That's not how an observer draws. That's how someone draws who has butchered this animal with their own hands, many times over generations. More than that, Aboriginal groups didn't just hunt. They managed the landscape for kangaroos, the practice we now call fire stick farming, burning patches of bush with cool, low-intensity fire. The logic is simple. A few weeks after a burn, young green grass comes up, kangaroos come to it, and the hunter knows in advance where they'll be. That isn't foraging. That's animal husbandry without a fence. That's herd management on a continental scale, practiced for tens of thousands of years. Here's the detail almost everyone misses.
By the time Europeans arrived, the kangaroo population in Australia was, by various reconstructions, not 50 million, but somewhere between 100 and 200 million. Which means that over 2 centuries of colonization, a population Aboriginal people had sustained for millennia dropped by a factor of several times over. Today's 50 million, they're overrunning everything, is, if those estimates hold, the remainder. Now the Europeans. The first written encounter we know in detail dates from June to August 1770. James Cook's Endeavour had struck the reef off the northeast coast, and the crew had to spend 7 weeks repairing the ship at the mouth of a river now called the Endeavour. 7 weeks ashore, without fresh meat, among the Gugu Yimithir people. On the 14th of July, Cook records in his journal that he has seen an unknown animal. On the 4th of August, he records its local name, called by the natives Kangaroo or Kangaroo.
Joseph Banks, the expedition's naturalist, writes down the same word on the 16th of August. That's how the word kangaroo entered English, from the Gugu Yimithir language, where it sounded roughly like gangaroo. And on the 23rd of August, 1770, Cook writes 4 words about the meat of this animal. We found very good eating. Hold on to that date. The first European culinary verdict on kangaroo meat was positive. The trouble comes later. In 1788, the first fleet lands at Sydney Cove. 11 ships, around 1,000 people, supplies calculated for a short window, soil that refuses to grow European wheat, and no resupply from the mother country. The colony starves. Genuinely starves. Rations cut, people dying of malnutrition. And the thing that saves Sydney in those first years is wild meat. Kangaroo, emu, fish. Officers send shooters into the bush not for sport, but because otherwise the colony doesn't survive until the next ship. Which means European Australia was, quite literally, built on kangaroo meat. And this is where a dish appears that explains half of our entire story. It's called kangaroo steamer. It's first documented in writing in 1820 by Charles Jeffreys. The recipe goes like this. Kangaroo meat is minced or finely chopped, packed into a tightly sealed vessel, and stewed for a very long time in its own juices, an adaptation of the Old English technique of jugging. But there's one mandatory ingredient without which the dish does not work. Salt pork, or bacon, non-negotiable. Why? Because the colonists ran into exactly what anyone runs into the first time they cook kangaroo. There's no fat in it. None. One colonial account puts it bluntly, like most really wild venison, it is too lean. There it is, the first knot in the paradox, and it was tied 200 years ago. The very property that dietitians praise kangaroo for today was, to a 19th century cook, a defect that had to be repaired with somebody else's fat. The dish caught on regardless. In 1837, Lady Jane Franklin, wife of the governor of Tasmania, is served steamer and pronounces it excellent. In 1864, the English and Australian cookery book by Edward Abbott is published in London, the first Australian cookbook, nearly 300 pages, 115 chapters, subtitled Cookery for the Many as well as for the Upper 10,000. It contains 3 versions of kangaroo steamer, including a recipe by Mrs. Sarah Crouch that was awarded the prize medal at the exhibition of 1862. It also has kangaroo ham made from the hind leg and instructions for roasting wombat and emu. So by the middle of the 19th century, kangaroo is not exotica and not survival rations. It's ordinary food, served to the poor and to the governor's wife alike, and people are winning medals at exhibitions for cooking it. And then it all breaks, very fast. How food was turned into vermin. The cause of the break was the sheep. 19th century colonial Australia ran on wool, on enormous pastoral runs, on millions of sheep, on capital invested in grass. And the kangaroo eats that same grass.
It isn't a predator. It doesn't take stock. It doesn't damage property. It just eats the same thing. And in the eyes of a grazier, it converts instantly from game into competitor. In 1877, the colony of Queensland passes an act whose name needs no interpretation: the Marsupial Destruction Act. The mechanism is the classic one. The state pays a bounty for a scalp. Bring proof of the kill, collect your money. The scheme runs for decades, and it runs efficiently.
Researchers estimate that between roughly 1877 and 1930, Queensland's bounty schemes accounted for up to 27 million marsupials, kangaroos, wallaroos, bandicoots, and others. 27 million, and that's not a typo, and that's one state. Think about what happens to the cultural category of an animal at this moment. In 1864, you win a medal at an exhibition for a kangaroo recipe. 13 years later, for that same animal, the state is paying money to make it stop existing. You cannot simultaneously classify something as a delicacy and as the target of a government extermination program. Brains don't work that way. Cultures don't either. And when you kill an animal for a scalp bounty, you don't need the carcass. You take the scalp, you collect your shilling, you walk away. The meat stays in the paddock, which is where a habit forms that will outlive the bounties themselves. A kangaroo is something you kill, not something you butcher.
By the middle of the 20th century, a proper industry has grown around this, but with a very telling specialization. There are two main products, and human food is not one of them. The first is leather. Kangaroo leather, K-leather, is a legend in its own right. Its fiber structure is more uniformly aligned than cowhide, which means that at the same strength, it can be split far thinner. For football boots, that's the holy grail. Minimal material between foot and ball with no loss of durability. The Puma King, worn by Pelé and Maradona. The Adidas Copa Mundial. For decades, the best boots in the world were made from kangaroo. The second is pet food. Lean, cheap, hypoallergenic meat that suits dogs and cats extremely well, especially ones with food intolerances. And now, the fact that everything before it was building towards. Until 1980, selling kangaroo meat for human consumption was illegal across almost all of Australia.
The first state to legalize sale for people was South Australia in 1980. In the rest of the country, kangaroo stayed off the legal human market until 1993 and 1994. And when it was finally legalized, it wasn't even by a decision about kangaroos. It was a side effect of mutual recognition legislation, which said that a product legally sold in one state cannot be prohibited in another. So in a country where the kangaroo was the foundation of the diet for 65,000 years, where it saved the first colony from starvation, where its recipes were printed in the first national cookbook, it has only been legal human food again for a little over 30 years. An entire generation grew up in Sydney for whom kangaroo was, legally speaking, dog food. 30 years. That's nothing. No cuisine in the world forms in 30 years. No shopping habit, no family tradition, no set of recipes handed down from a grandmother. When we ask why Australians don't eat kangaroo, what we're really asking is why a whole country hasn't invented an entire meat culture from scratch within a single human lifetime. But that only explains the laws and the habits. It doesn't explain why the meat itself behaves differently in a pan from beef. And it does behave differently, and that part is pure biochemistry. The meat that's built wrong. Take a 100-gram piece of kangaroo fillet. It contains about 1 gram of fat, exactly 1. For comparison, the same amount of beef fillet gives you over 6, chicken breast about 1.5, which means kangaroo is leaner than chicken. Red meat that's leaner than white. Keep going. 22 grams of protein per 100 grams. That's a serve of protein roughly the size of a deck of cards, covering a substantial share of an adult's daily requirement. Iron. Between 2.5 and 3.5 milligrams per 100 grams, in heme form, the form the body absorbs best. Zinc. Abundant. Vitamin B12. Abundant. And there's one more component that very few people know about. In 2004, Claire Engelke, a PhD student at the University of Western Australia, working in collaboration with the University of Adelaide, published findings on conjugated linoleic acid, CLA, in kangaroo meat. The result? Up to 5 times higher than lamb. It was the first publicly available research on CLA in kangaroo. CLA is a fatty acid that's been the subject of decades of research into body composition and metabolism. And here's a paradox inside the paradox. a meat with almost no fat in it carries a record concentration of one particular beneficial fatty acid. So why is it so hard to cook? Because of that 1%. Fat in meat isn't just calories, it's a buffer. It's the thing that melts under heat, lubricates the fibers, carries flavor, and above all, forgives the cook's mistakes. A beefsteak has a window of several minutes where it's right. A kangaroo fillet has almost no window at all. 90 seconds too long, and you've made a shoe sole. It doesn't go a bit dry. It goes tough, livery, metallic, with a pronounced gamey note that a person expecting beef reads as off. And here is the mechanism that kills entire product categories. A shopper buys an unfamiliar meat once. They cook it like beef because it's red and it looks like beef. They get a tough piece with a metallic taste. They conclude, kangaroo is horrible, and they never buy it again. One bad dinner closes the product for life. 200 years ago, the colonists solved this head-on by adding salt pork. We lost that skill and never acquired a replacement. Now let's look inside the animal, because something happens in there that has made the kangaroo an object of intense interest to climate scientists over the last 15 years. The kangaroo, like a cow, is a foregut fermenter.
Like a ruminant, it has a large forward chamber where bacteria break down the cellulose its own body can't digest. Logic says, same mechanism, therefore same methane. Methane is a byproduct of that fermentation. Methanogenic archaea take hydrogen and carbon dioxide and turn them into CH4. But the kangaroo numbers never added up. Measurements kept coming back anomalously low. The answer arrived in 2011. A research group in which Mark Morrison and Athol Cleave played key roles, working across CSIRO and the University of Queensland, published a paper in Science with an unglamorous title, on the isolation of Succinivibrio bacteria implicated in low methane emissions from Tamar wallabies. They isolated a dominant strain designated WG1. Here's what it does. The normal microflora of a cow's rumen produces hydrogen during fermentation, and methanogens convert that hydrogen into methane, which goes into the atmosphere.
Succinivibrio works down a different pathway. It intercepts the carbon and hydrogen and routes them into succinate, a compound that stays inside the system and benefits the animal, rather than flying off into the sky as a greenhouse gas. The methanogens simply don't get the raw material. The result reported in that paper: wallabies emit roughly 80% less methane per unit of digestible energy intake than livestock. 80%. On the same feed, with the same type of digestion. The difference is which bacteria live there. But we have to be honest here, because science didn't stop in 2011. In 2015, Adam Munn, a biologist at the University of Wollongong, published a paper in the Journal of Experimental Biology that cooled the enthusiasm somewhat. He showed that kangaroos are not, in fact, zero. An adult animal produces on the order of 1,000 liters of methane a year.
Munn's own framing was careful. Kangaroo methane is low, he said, but not as low as some earlier studies had suggested. 1,000 liters a year sounds like a lot, until you put a cow next to it. A cow produces between 250 and 500 liters of methane per day, which means one kangaroo over an entire year produces about as much methane as a cow does in 2 to 4 days. And that's still only half the environmental story. The other half is feet. Cattle and sheep have hooves, hard, narrow, high pressure per unit of area. On damp European soil, that doesn't matter much. On fragile Australian ground, which evolved over millions of years without large hoofed animals, it's destructive. The hoof compacts the top layer, breaks the crust, and starts erosion. The kangaroo has a soft foot with an elastic pad. It doesn't cut the soil, it pushes off it.
And it moves on tendon springs. At cruising speed, hopping costs it less energy than running costs a quadruped of the same mass. It covers enormous distances between water sources on minimal calories and needs remarkably little external water. A large share of it comes from the grass itself. If someone were asked to design a herbivore specifically for the Australian climate, what they'd come up with is a kangaroo. So why does a continent that argues about drought, rangeland degradation, and emissions every single year keep eating cow? If you enjoy digging into things like this, where biology collides with economics and loses, subscribe right now, because the algorithm will stop showing you this video unless you signal that you want to keep watching. And what's coming next is the most uncomfortable part. The best option didn't win. The first one did. There's one example that explains how the world works better than any economic theory. the QWERTY keyboard. The arrangement of letters on your keyboard is not optimal. It never was optimal for typing speed. More ergonomic layouts exist, but QWERTY took the market first. Millions of typists were trained on it, millions of machines were built for it, and at some point the cost of switching became higher than the benefit of switching. And that was that. Argument closed permanently. The best option doesn't win. The one that captures the infrastructure first wins. That is precisely what happened with meat in Australia. Look at the scale. Tyson Foods, the largest meat processor in the United States, handles 155,000 head of cattle a week across 11 facilities, 42 million chickens a week across 167 facilities, 133,000 employees, annual sales of $54 billion. That isn't a company. That's a planetary-scale logistics system in which an animal moves along a conveyor from pen to vacuum pack in a matter of hours, and every second of that journey has been costed. The Australian beef industry is built the same way. 9.25 million head a year, 2.87 million tons of product. Feedlots, sale yards, stock trucks, accredited abattoirs, cold chain, export certificates, supermarket contracts signed years ahead, advertising, industry bodies, lobbyists. Now here's how the kangaroo industry works. No farms, none at all. Kangaroos can't be efficiently bred in pens. They're wild herd animals with an enormous range. They suffer stress in captivity, they breed poorly, and they injure themselves. So the whole industry is a field harvest, at night. A licensed shooter drives out into the bush in a ute, works with a spotlight, is required to make a single accurate headshot, dresses the carcass on the spot, and drives it to a refrigerated chiller box that might sit 100 kilometers from the nearest processing plant. From there, it goes to the works. Compare those two pictures. On one side, a conveyor handling 155,000 animals a week in a temperature-controlled building. On the other, a man with a rifle in the dark in the middle of a desert whose entire production cycle rests on his personal marksmanship and on whether he gets the carcass to a fridge in time. Guess which of those two systems has a more predictable unit cost? Hence the figures that put everything in place. The Australian kangaroo industry is valued at around $175 million. The beef industry, around $6 billion. A gap of nearly 35 times. And this is with kangaroo raw material being free and lying on the ground. And here's the single most telling detail of all. The government allows far more to be taken than the industry is capable of taking. South Australia, 2023. Quota, 634,200 animals. Actual harvest, 100,594. 16%. 16. In 2024, 15% across the first 10 months. The picture in other states is the same. Queensland has used around 20% of quota in some years, New South Wales around 15%. Pause for a second and think about what that means. It means that the story of Australia is exterminating millions of kangaroos because there are too many of them, however emotionally powerful it is, describes something economically very different from what we assume. The state says, you may take 600,000. The market answers, I don't need 600,000. I can't even move 100,000. Nationally, around 1.5 million kangaroos are actually taken each year, roughly 3% of the population. The break here isn't animal advocates, and it isn't quotas. The break is demand, and that demand is also extraordinarily fragile because it's an export demand. Here's what happened in 2009. The single largest buyer of Australian kangaroo meat in the world at that point was Russia, not Australia, Russia. The meat went mostly into sausage production. In mid-2009, the Russian authorities found excessive bacterial contamination in shipments, E. coli, and closed the market. For the industry, the result was close to catastrophic. Harvest volumes fell to roughly 20 to 30% of pre-ban levels. Prices collapsed. Shooters left the profession en masse, and a shooter who leaves, sells the rifle, and finds another job does not come back at the flick of a switch. The ban lasted about 3.5 years. It wasn't until the 2nd of November 2012 that the first Adelaide-based company was cleared to resume exports. There is the whole problem in a single episode. An entire national industry was knocked flat by a decision from another country's food safety regulator because it had no domestic market to fall back on. And this is where the trap closes into a perfect circle. There's no domestic market because there's no infrastructure and the product is expensive and unfamiliar. The infrastructure doesn't get built because there's no domestic market. Nobody is going to sink $100 million into abattoirs, cold chain, and marketing for a product the customer tried once, overcooked in a pan, and decided was horrible. But that only explains the supply side. It doesn't explain why the customer refuses to buy it even when they're looking at it on the shelf, at a reasonable price, in nice packaging, with a recipe on the label. Because Kangaroo is in Australian supermarkets. It sits next to the beef. It's frequently cheaper, and they still don't buy it. The explanation for that lives somewhere else entirely, not in economics, in the head.
You can't eat the animal that holds the shield. Pull up the Australian coat of arms. There's a shield, and on either side of it, 2 supporters. On the left, an emu. On the right, a kangaroo. The current version was granted in 1912. The first was 1908. There's an appealing explanation for the choice. Neither animal can walk backwards, so they symbolize a country that only moves forward. Historians are skeptical of it, but it's been repeated for 100 years. It's told to children, and culturally, it has become true. Kangaroo on the $1 coin. Kangaroo on the tail of the national carrier's aircraft. Kangaroo on the road signs. Kangaroo as the nickname of national sporting teams. Kangaroo as the thing tourists fly across the world to see. Now add childhood. 1926, A. Milne publishes Winnie the Pooh. Among the residents of the 100-acre wood are Kanga and Baby Roo, a mother and a child. Kanga is the most maternal character in the entire book. Caring, anxious, with a son sitting in her pouch. Not a predator, not a villain, not comic relief. A mother. 1968, the 5th of February. Australian television broadcast the first episode of Skippy the Bush Kangaroo. 91 episodes, filmed between 1967 and 1969. And then something nobody anticipated happens. The show sells, by various counts, into 128 countries. The Skippy fan club runs to more than 67,000 members. Toys, clothing, ice cream, toothpaste. Skippy is an Australian lassie, only marsupial. An animal that understands human speech, rescues children, solves crimes, and clicks at the camera. For an entire generation of viewers around the world, the kangaroo is not a biological species. It's a character with a name and a personality. And now, the mechanism that turns all of this into a refusal to eat. In 1997, Psychological Science published a paper by Paul Rosen, Maureen Marquith, and Karen Stoss of the University of Pennsylvania titled Moralization and Becoming a Vegetarian. Rosen is the man who spent a career studying disgust and how cultures decide what is food and what isn't, and he described a process he called moralization. It goes like this. Some things we simply don't like. That's a matter of preference, of taste. But sometimes a preference crosses into a different category. It becomes a value, a moral judgment. And at that moment, in the transition from I don't like this to this is wrong, disgust switches on. Not a rational argument. Physiological disgust, the emotion that originally evolved to keep us away from spoiled food and contagion. Rosen demonstrated this with vegetarians. People who gave up meat for moral reasons developed genuine disgust at the smell and sight of it over time. People who gave it up for health reasons did not. The same behavioral refusal, 2 different mechanisms. And the moral mechanism turns out to be incomparably more durable. Apply that to the kangaroo. We are not dealing with a rational consumer weighing protein, iron, price, and emissions. We are dealing with a person for whom this animal sits in the category marked one of us. National symbol, childhood friend, a character with a name. And the moment an animal lands in that category, the question of eating it stops being culinary. It becomes moral. Which means disgust switches on, and no nutritional table on earth is going to override it. That's exactly why the argument, kangaroo is healthier than beef, is doomed. It's being made in the language of facts against an opponent answering in the language of emotion. Different operating systems. And the pet food legacy lands right here too. For decades, kangaroo was legally available only as pet food. The label stuck. This is dog meat. Psychologically, moving a product from the category of the dog's bowl to the category of steak for guests is close to impossible. In the human food hierarchy, that's an upward move, and products almost never move upward. Downward is easy, upward almost never. Add the ethical thread that has intensified over the last 20 years. The harvest happens at night, in the field, and its most painful aspect is the fate of the young. A female may have a joey in the pouch, and the protocols prescribe killing it. Activist organizations have built a formidable campaign on this, and it worked. But it worked first and foremost on European buyers and global brands, not on Australians. In March 2023, Nike and Puma announced a complete withdrawal from kangaroo leather, and from the start of 2024, that decision took effect worldwide. Adidas came under legal and public pressure, including in California, where the sale of kangaroo products is prohibited by law.
A material that had been considered the best in football for decades left the industry in a couple of years.
Notice the curious turn there. The leather side of the industry, which used to be its economic backbone, is collapsing faster than the food side is growing, which means the paradox isn't dissolving, it's deepening. And there's one more layer that gets far too little airtime in this argument. The kangaroo was a central food and a central spiritual figure for Aboriginal peoples for 65,000 years. Today, when decisions are made about who harvests kangaroos, how many and how, representation of Indigenous communities in those decisions remains limited, and the mechanisms for sharing the benefits remain opaque. The peoples who are the only ones on Earth with millennia of experience in sustainably managing this resource have largely been left outside the industry built on it. That, incidentally, is also part of the answer to the question in the title.
A culture of eating kangaroo does exist. It's simply not the culture the colonial economy took into account. If this kind of breakdown works for you, where a simple question like, "Why don't we eat this?" turns out to have 5 interlocking layers underneath it, subscribing takes a second and directly determines whether you see the next one. Now let's step outside Australia, because from the outside, the picture looks completely different, where this has been normal for a long time. Here's a fact that usually baffles Australians. The world's largest importer of kangaroo meat is neither Australia nor anywhere in Asia. It's Belgium. According to 2016 figures, Belgium imported 632 tons of kangaroo meat, roughly 180,000 animals. A country you could drive across in an afternoon, where kangaroos have never lived, sits at number 1 in the world for imports. Second place, Germany. Third, Papua New Guinea. In Belgium and the Netherlands, kangaroo steak is an ordinary item in a butcher's shop and on a restaurant menu. In Germany, it's sold as game, in the same category as venison and wild boar. And that's the key to everything, because there was already a cultural shelf waiting for it. You don't have to explain lean wild meat to a German. They have wild, they have a hunting tradition, they have recipes built on long braising and a rich sauce. They just put the kangaroo on an existing shelf. Australia doesn't have that shelf. Australian meat culture is the barbecue. Fast fire, grill, steak and sausage. The worst possible way to treat a meat that's 1% fat. Australia exports kangaroo to around 70 countries. Russia, as we've said, was the biggest market until 2009. And that's a cultural story of its own. Millions of people ate kangaroo inside processed sausage without giving it much thought, because the meat had no face, no name, and no cartoon. Now widen the lens, and it becomes obvious that there is no such thing as an inedible animal. There are only local agreements about who counts as edible. In Peru, the guinea pig, cuy, isn't a pet. It's a traditional festive dish going back to pre-Inca times. The annual count runs into the tens of millions. And in the cathedral in Cusco hangs a famous colonial painting of the Last Supper, with a cuy laid out on the table in front of Christ and the apostles. Imagine, for a second, the reaction of a European child whose guinea pig lives in a cage in the bedroom. In Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, horse meat is neither exotic nor a gesture of desperation, but a prestige food. Kazi, shuzhuk, beshbarmak. And the horse is an animal treated with something close to reverence in steppe culture. So it turns out deep respect for an animal and eating it coexist perfectly well, which means the argument, "you can't eat a symbol," is not universal. It's culturally specific. In Finland, Sweden, and Norway, reindeer is a standard supermarket product. The reindeer is the symbol of Lapland, a tourist magnet, a character in Christmas mythology in the most literal sense, and simultaneously a perfectly ordinary dinner. In Namibia and South Africa, game, springbok, kudu, oryx, is an established meat industry exporting into Europe, running on a logic strikingly similar to the kangaroo model: wild animal, field harvest, lean meat, arid landscape. The only difference is that society there doesn't consider the food strange. And there's the cognitive dissonance in full view. A Finn eats the reindeer that symbolizes their region. A Kazakh eats the horse they revere. A Peruvian eats the animal a European keeps in a cage in a child's bedroom. A Belgian, who has never had a kangaroo within 2 continents of them, eats kangaroo. And the Australian, with 50 million of them past the fence, buys beef. None of these peoples is right, and none is wrong.
Each simply grew up inside its own agreement. And that is the best possible proof that the barrier here isn't biological and isn't logical. It's entirely negotiated. Why this stopped being a curiosity? If this were only a culinary oddity, we could stop here. But over the last 20 years, the conversation has shifted, and what shifted it is the climate. Australia is the driest inhabited continent on the planet. Drought here isn't an anomaly, it's part of a cycle, and the forecasts say that cycle is getting harsher. And in a drought, the whole architecture of European-style livestock farming starts failing at every seam at once. Pastures burn off, stock has to be fed on trucked-in feed, water has to be pumped, animals lose condition, farmers go under, and soil broken up by hooves blows away as dust. And the kangaroo, meanwhile, is simply there. It doesn't need bore water or grain or shade or treatment for heat stress. It evolved for exactly this landscape. Its soft foot doesn't break the soil crust. Its foregut, colonized by Succinea vibrianaceae, releases a fraction of the methane. Its hop is energetically cheap. In a dry year, the kangaroo population falls, and then recovers by itself, with no government subsidy. Out of this grew an idea that has its own name: Kangatarianism. The word Kangatarian appeared in Australian English around the turn of the 2010s, in Sydney, and has already made it into dictionaries as a recognized Australian coinage. A Kangatarian is someone who has given up industrially farmed meat but eats kangaroo. The logic runs: the animal lived its life free, without a pen, without a truck ride to an abattoir, without formulated feed or antibiotics, and died in the field from a single shot. From an animal welfare standpoint, its advocates argue, that may be more honest than a feedlot steak. It's a serious argument, and it has serious counter-arguments. The first concerns pouch young, and the fact that a single accurate shot is a standard, not a guarantee. Nobody is monitoring execution quality in a paddock at night in real time. The second, ecologists warn that if domestic demand suddenly grew tenfold, the current model of taking 3% of the population would stop applying, and the sustainability question would have to be answered again, at a completely different scale. The third is sanitary. Field dressing at 30 degrees in the bush is objectively harder to control than a plant with laminar airflow, and the Russian ban of 2009 demonstrated exactly that. The fourth is ethical and political. Without real participation from indigenous peoples, any new wave of commercialization will simply repeat the old pattern. So the honest conclusion is this: kangaroo isn't a ready-made solution to a climate problem. It's an open fork in the road, and both roads carry a cost. But the fork is real, and it has to be argued out not in theory, but in a country that already burns every other summer. Back to the beginning. Go back to where we started. 1.5 million tons of living meat. 150 Eiffel Towers hopping across red earth. Meat with 1% fat, with heme iron, with record CLA, grown without a single kilogram of grain, without a single liter of irrigation water, without a single injection, on grass that grew by itself. Only now you know why it stays out there. It stays out there because in 1877 the colony of Queensland started paying for scalps, and 27 million animals were killed as vermin rather than butchered as food. Because until 1980, it was illegal to sell that meat to people, and until 1993, across the rest of the country, and a whole generation grew up believing it was dog food. Because there's too little fat in it, so anyone who cooks it like a steak ruins it on the first attempt and never comes back. Because building a cold chain around night shooting in a desert costs more than maintaining a conveyor running 155,000 head a week, and the market is so thin that one foreign regulator's decision flattened the industry for 3.5 years. Because this animal holds the shield on the national coat of arms, rescues children in a series watched in 128 countries, and tucks a baby into her pouch in a book read at bedtime. And Paul Rozin showed back in the 90s that once a preference becomes a moral judgment, disgust switches on, and arguing with it using numbers is pointless. 5 factors, each one on its own surmountable, all of them together, a wall. And the most uncomfortable thing in this whole story isn't that Australians don't eat kangaroo,
The most uncomfortable thing is that every one of us lives inside a wall exactly like it, and simply can't see it. Today you have probably eaten, or are about to eat, something that half the planet finds either bizarre or sacrilegious. And you will almost certainly refuse to eat something entirely normal, nutritious and available, purely because your culture once filed it under not food and never revisited the decision. We almost never choose our food. Our food was chosen for us long before we were born, by a law, a coat of arms, a cartoon, a cookbook, somebody's scalp bounty, and somebody's badly cooked dinner. So here's the question I'll leave you with. What animal or food do you personally refuse to eat? And can you honestly explain why, without falling back on habit or on what you were told as a child? Put it in the comments. I'm genuinely curious how many people have a real answer. And if you like it when a simple-looking question gets taken apart all the way down to archival legislation, laboratory papers, and bacteria with unpronounceable names, subscribe. There are several more stories coming that do exactly this, about the food that's right under our noses and the reasons we can't see it.